thanks to Richard for the reading. I about got up and started to come. I knew I had a job to do, and I was ready to get it going. And Ben said, hey, there's a reading. I said, oh, you guys do readings here. It's been a month, remember, since we've been here on a Sunday. But it's good to see everybody out. But I did have a job to do, and I was thinking, appropriately so, talking about jobs. I had seen some study. I like to, from time to time, just see what surveys, and I've used those in some lessons before, and we'll use them again in the future, but surveys about work and about jobs and about people having jobs. And it's said today that people that are in the workforce right now have had 12.1, I think this is USA Today, 12.1 career changes during their work life. 12.1 different jobs. Whoever had the point one, that's the job you want. That's the one you're looking for. And that's interesting, isn't it, to think that people change jobs that much. Another study, and this was USA Today, said that the millennials, it was projected that they would have 15 by the time they complete their work. And that is astounding, and it makes you think about, well, if you're going to have that many job changes, it makes you wonder what makes you make the change. Why would that happen? And wanted to look at that this evening. There was an NPR survey done in the last couple of years that I found, and the question was raised: why do people quit their job? They asked people across all the workforce, all professions, all businesses, all industries, and the question was, why did you quit? And the NPR survey had the top 5 that we'll look at this evening, in no particular order. It's only the top 5, and these are the ones that we're going to look at, are the ones that they responded to. So I know there's going to be others, and at the end of the service, at the end of the lesson, you might have some others that maybe that's why you quit. Some others, and I'm sure there's others like people would quit because they couldn't do the job, they weren't capable. People probably quit because they were lazy. People probably quit because they were fired. You can't fire me, I quit. But I'm sure the people that responded to this NPR survey probably didn't list those. But we are going to look at the 5 reasons why people quit. And as we do, we want to make some correlations, because I think we can understand that people quit various things all for the same reasons. And if we can understand why people quit their jobs, maybe we can make some correlation to why people might quit the church. As we study this evening, I'm going to suggest to you that there's some good lessons here. As I was reading the results of the survey, I was astounded to realize or to consider that the 5 reasons that NPR found that people would quit their jobs are reasons why people quit the church. And if we can understand that, maybe we can do something about it for those that have quit, and maybe we can guard against it to make sure that we don't find those same impulses, those same desires to quit the church for our own selves. So as we go through this, I thought this would be helpful, and maybe it'll be useful. Maybe you're ready to quit a job. Find one of these 5 reasons. Maybe you're feeling that way in your personal life, in your Christian life. Maybe these are impulses that you're feeling, and let's guard against that. So let's look at just a few things while the time we have this evening. I tried to fix some font, but it didn't really work very well. I've had some technical issues with computers and switching over, but in any event, let me do one thing real quick that might resolve this, if I can find it. Let's do this one. A little bit better. First thing I want to look at this evening, And I did it on a chalkboard because, like I said this morning, I'm used to chalkboards, but this saves me from writing. The first thing we want to look at is people said they had lost their value, that the work that they were doing had lost its meaning. They were no longer seeing the point in or the value in the work that they were undertaking. They weren't inspired. It wasn't fun anymore. They saw no value in the job that they were doing. You ever felt that way in your own job? Sure you have. It wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't fulfilling. There's no value. I don't see the reason I'm doing it. Work had lost its meaning. I would suggest to you that's not only why people quit jobs, that's why people quit life. Suicide, when we think about that, people become disenchanted with life itself. They come to the conclusion that life has no meaning, life has no value, and therefore I'm going to quit life. And that's why suicide happens so often. They don't see any value to it. There's a man by the name of Mac Lyon. He was a preacher for 30-some years. Maybe some of you have seen him. He had a television show out of Oklahoma for years and years. And I had one of his books, and the book was called Life, Death, and Beyond. And he reasoned on this subject, and he came to the conclusion that life has meaning. And this is Mac Lyon's quote: "Life has a meaning when we have found the purpose that is bigger than life itself." When you're into something and you see no value and you see no benefit of it, we begin to be disenchanted when life and work loses its meaning. I would suggest to you that people quit the church for the same reason. They don't see any value in their effort. They lose their energy. They lose sight of, or they never understood the meaning of the service to begin with. They never understood why they were doing it to begin with. And that can only go on for so long, because after a while you begin to question, what am I doing this for? What benefit is it? In John chapter 6, Christ was teaching that all things were sustained in and through him. He uses the analogy of bread and partaking of him. And what he's getting at with, first of all, the Pharisees, what he's getting at is he was the sustainer. He was the reason for it all. And the Pharisees, first of all, began to murmur about that. In verse 41, and the Jews then murmured at him and said, "Because I am the bread which came down from heaven." They didn't understand it. They didn't accept it. They were confused by it. They said, "How can we eat of this man? He's flesh," and all that. What he was teaching was that he was the sustainer of all. And if you're in it for him. And not only did the Jews not understand it, he goes on and continues to develop this thought, and even his own disciples didn't understand it. If you look at verse 60, and starting at verse 59, "These things said he in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Many therefore of the disciples, when they heard this, said, 'This is a hard saying. Who can hear it? Who can comprehend it? Who can understand it?'" They didn't understand where the value of their service came from. He began to teach them. He turned from the Jews to his specific disciples, and he began to teach them. And in verse 61, "And when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples had murmured at him, he said, 'Does this thing offend you? Don't you understand?' He said, 'What, and if ye shall see the Son of Man ascend up there he was before? It is the Spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit, and they are life. But there are some of you that believe not.' For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not, and who should betray him." And in verse 65 he said, "And he said, Therefore said I unto you, that no man can come unto me, except it were given unto him of my Father." Some of you guys, he says, some of you don't even understand the value. You don't understand the purpose of it. And as I said, those that quit and they say work has lost its meaning, I'm sure that happens to some, but I'm sure that they didn't know the meaning of it to begin with. And if we are in the church and we see some falling away, I would suggest to you that some fall away because they don't understand the true meaning of service to God. And yes, some of his disciples fell away in verse 66. From that time, many of the disciples went back and walked no more with him. It's fair to be honest in both questions I'm going to ask. First of all, you felt that way in one of your 12.1 jobs. That I'm in a job and I don't know why I'm doing it. I don't know why I'm doing this job. It has no purpose. It has no value. Keeping on the profession for a minute, the most successful, the way that we can be most successful is to find value in whatever we're doing in the workforce. That keeps you happy. It keeps you going. It keeps you efficient. It keeps you productive. To understand that what you're doing has value. And there's danger when we lose that sight. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, there's danger for you and I if we begin to lose sight of the value that we have, or the value in service. When our work for the Lord has lost its value, it's lost its meaning. Verse 13, he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its savor or its effectiveness, wherewith shall it be salted? It is henceforth good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden underfoot of men." Unfortunately, many Christians quit. They quit because they've lost their way. They don't see the value in service. They've been unproductive, ineffective, and no longer see the meaning of what they are doing. And that's a sad thing. You and I need to always rekindle that love for Christ and that love for God, and to know that what we are doing has great value. Not only for your own soul, but for the souls of others. Being a good Christian, being a faithful person. The great value it has for a loving and faithful wife to be there when the husband is going through troubles and trials, and conversely, the steadfast husband that is strong and steady, how he can provide support, an unwavering support for the wife when she's going through issues. And you can input any relationship that you have in this life, and you can see the value that you have from simply just being a Christian. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 58, talking about life and death, and that Christ, through his death, burial, and resurrection, overcame the sting of death. And here he's talking about remaining faithful and being steadfast, but in verse 58 he says it this way. He says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord." And here's what we want. "For as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." People quit their jobs because they don't see that their labor is any benefit anymore. Christ says, Paul here says, be steadfast and unmovable, always abounding in the work of your Lord. Don't quit that work. For as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. We have brothers and sisters that have quit. It's because they think their labor is in vain in the Lord, and we have to rekindle that. And if you're ever have those thoughts, realize that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. It's not only good for your soul, but it's good for others. I have a few things to go over, so we'll keep going. Reason number 2 on the NPR National Public Radio Survey said, why'd you quit your job? Well, I just was not treated very well. My boss didn't treat me well. My coworkers didn't treat me well. My customers didn't treat me well. If you're a teacher, my students didn't treat me well. I wasn't treated well. and therefore I went and got another job. There was no encouragement. There was no support. It was what we call today a hostile work environment. And because of that, I'm going somewhere else. And people change jobs because of that, and rightly so. Who would want to live there? Who would want to be in that relationship? People said, I quit my job because I didn't like the people I worked with, and they didn't like me. I wasn't treated well. Again, isn't that a reason why people quit a lot of things? Quit their jobs? Students transfer schools because they don't have any friends in their school. They say they're not treated well in the school. And I'm not suggesting that that's right or wrong, or it's true or false, or it does or does not happen, but that's the reason. I'm going to another school because I'm not treated well in this school. Maybe I get a new start. That's why people quit their marriages. My spouse doesn't treat me well, in my mind. That's why people quit the church. That's why people quit the church. This is two-sided here as we think about this. It's two-sided. First of all, we have the responsibility to have a loving and a welcoming environment here in the church, so that somebody cannot validly say they were mistreated here at East Cambridge or whatever congregation. In James chapter 3, I'm going to walk all over Larry's Bible study here. In James chapter 3, and there's something you want to take over this part? Okay. Just a few things that are applicable to what Larry's been studying and applicable lesson today. In James chapter 3, he does talk about hostility and a hostile environment and hostile relationships, doesn't he? Talks about the tongue and about how we treat each other, and how we just talked about that this morning. In verses 8 through 10, he says, but the tongue, this is where I said you could do this, but the tongue can no man tame. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poisons. Therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not so to be. If we are that way in the church, we have created a hostile work environment. If we are cursing each other, we are speaking ill of each other, we don't have that love one for another, we have created a hostile work environment, and people leave the church because of those situations. I was talking to the brother last week, and after the services, he said, I preached this lesson down at Eddie's Ridge last week, and he said, yeah, I know what you're talking about. He said, I can remember 20 years ago how we were mistreated, and my mother did not attend because of how she was treated. That could be so, but we got to let it go. If we're talking about issues and offenses of 20 years ago, and you haven't buried that or you haven't resolved that, that's the other part of it. Maybe we're mistreating each other as well. Maybe the mistreated are the ones that are mistreating us well. What I'm getting at is at the end of James chapter 3, he makes a statement, and then he makes a very stark contrast. As Larry mentioned this morning in our study, verse 18 is a wonderful verse. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace. When you talk about making peace in the church, that is the fruit of righteousness, working together and making peace. And that's the way it should be. But then the stark contrast is in verse 1 of the next chapter. Read these two verses with me. For whence comes wars and fightings among you? What's going on? Where are they coming from? They come not from hence, even of your own lust, or come they not hence, even of your lust that war in your members. Ye lust and have not, ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain, ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not. What's he talking about? He says, first of all, in verse 1, where's this all coming from? There's fightings, there's conflicts. Even it says wars, not in a literal standpoint, but there's an uneasiness there. Where does it come from? It comes from your own lust. We got problems in the church. Somebody's envying or desiring. And he says, ye lust and you have not. Ye kill and desire to have, and ye cannot obtain. You're never happy. Not you. But that's what he's talking about. You're never happy. It's not a good environment. It's a hostile work environment. In verse 3 he says, well, first of all, in verse 2 he says, ye fight and war, yet ye have not, because ye ask not. And in verse 3 he says, when you do ask, you don't ask in the right way. You receive it not, because ye ask amiss, that ye may consume it upon your own lust. That's like asking God something. That's like asking God to put a curse on an enemy. That's like asking God to strike somebody with a curse, or that's like asking God or wishing ill upon somebody else. You ask amiss because of your own lust. Hostile work environment. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and this is why I say it goes both ways, because we have to make sure that we're not creating a hostile environment. We have to create an environment out of love. But so many times we have those feelings of not being treated well, and they're not always well-founded. You ever have hear of individuals that are never happy, never satisfied with what the church is doing for them, that always have complaints about what brother or sister failed to do for them? They never help me, they're never there. We have to be careful about that. If there's a real need, we have to recognize it and we have to support that need. But at the same time, we should realize that the more that we can make the focus the other person, the more our needs are met. If we have more desire for somebody else than our own, it's amazing how our own needs are met. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. If there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort in love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, any bowels and mercies, he's talking about having a good relationship in the church. He says, if that's going to happen, he says, fulfill ye my joy, that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. And in verse 3, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, like James chapter 4 and verses 1 and 2. Let nothing be done through strife and vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than themselves. What's he saying? He said, why don't we look out for each other first? And if everybody does that, it takes away that hostile work environment. You think about back in the workplace, if in the workplace everybody was more concerned about the other's well-being than their own, things might go a little bit smoother. That's what happens in the workplace, isn't it? Things don't go well because everybody's looking out for themselves. Everybody's trying to get better. And you hear about that corporate ladder, about stepping on somebody as they're going up the ladder. We're all worried about it in the business world. We're all worried about our own desires and our own needs and fulfilling our own wants. Getting the next raise. It creates some hostility. The same can happen in the church. We need to stop allowing that hostile work environment in the church, and we need to esteem others greater than ourselves. And maybe we'll see the love that others show for us and the support that they have for us. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 and 15, follow peace with all men, and holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord, looking diligently lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Hebrews 13, 1 through 3, let brotherly love continue. Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. Remember them that are in bonds, as bonds with them, and them which suffer adversity, as being yourselves also in the body. One thing we ought to all be thankful for is the unity that we have here at East Cambridge. We need to continue to work to maintain that unity so that no one even has an inkling of the feeling that they are mistreated. Next thing we want to look at, people in this survey said they quit because they weren't getting any support. They weren't getting the tools they needed. They weren't getting the manpower, the assistance, whatever resources. Somebody would tell them to do something and buy something, but they didn't provide them the funds to do it. They had to do it all. They were overwhelmed and could not keep up. And here it is. They thought they were the only ones that were really doing the job. The other guys, they were goofballs. They were misfits. They weren't pulling their own weight. They were the only ones pulling their weight, and I'm not going to put up with this. So they quit their job. We better be careful for that in the church as well. First of all, we have to be careful not to have that attitude. I'm the only one doing it. I'm the only one, nobody else in the congregation is pulling their weight. Elijah. 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah. One thing, and you love Elijah, but Elijah displays a character trait that is very dangerous that we want to look at here. And if somebody thinks I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong after services. But what Elijah said here is, first of all, Elijah did many things for the Lord. In 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 20. Here he's against King Ahab, and not only Ahab, but the 450 prophets of Baal. And he stood up face to face with this Ahab. And in verse 20 it says, so Ahab went unto the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together unto Mount Carmel, and Elijah came unto all the people and said, how long halt ye between two opinions? Wonderful thing. If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. And the people answered him not. Then said Elijah unto the people, even I only remain a prophet in the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. That's what's dangerous. What does Elijah say? He says, I'm the only one here, and I'm going to stand up against not only Ahab, but I'm going to stand up against all those 450 prophets of Baal. And you might say, well, Ron, he did, didn't he? Well, he did, didn't he? He did. He stood up against those 450 prophets of Baal. He not only stood up against them, he showed that their God was false. And after doing that, he had those 450 prophets of Baal killed. He stood up against them. You know, that attitude, though, is not healthy. That attitude of I, only I, is not sustainable in the church. It's not sustainable anywhere. To think you're the only one doing the job and everybody else is a misfit and they're not doing it and they're just going to let me do my thing. I have to do everything. It's not sustainable. How do we know that? In the case of Elijah. Later on, not very much later on, after he had slain the 450 prophets of Baal, Jezebel gets wind of it, Ahab's wife, and she says, I'm going to take care of you just like you did those 450 prophets of Baal. For whatever reason, Ahab did not have that steadfastness that he was needful of, because we know in chapter 19 that now we find Elijah in a cave. Verses 8 through 10 of 1 Kings 19. And we know how the Lord came to him, but it wasn't in a wind, it wasn't in an earthquake, it wasn't in a fire, it was in a small, still voice. But in verse 8, and he arose and did eat and drink and went in the strength of that man 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb the Mount of God. And he came thither into a cave and lodged there, and beheld the word of the Lord came unto him and said unto him, What are you doing here, Elijah? What doest thou here, Elijah? And Elijah's response, he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain the prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life also. That attitude is not sustainable. That attitude of, I'm not getting any support here. Because he went and hid himself in a cave when he had to fight Jezebel. That attitude is not only not sustainable, but that attitude is wrong. You think you're the only one working for the Lord? If we have that feeling, I'm pulling my weight, but nobody else is. The Lord said in verse 18, Yet have I left 7,000 in Israel, and all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. Don't ever feel that I am the only one, because you're not. And let me say something else. Don't ever let somebody in the church be the only one. Sometimes we sit back and we say, if they want to do it, let them do it. If they want to do the kids' class, let them do it. If they want to take care of that, let them do it. We'll let them take on as much as they want. It's not sustainable. Have to work together. In Luke chapter 10 is another example in the New Testament. We can get ourselves so overwhelmed and consumed that we find ourselves needing to quit something. In Luke chapter 10, we know that Christ had a close relationship with the man Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. And in Luke chapter 10, Christ is at their house, and they're entertaining them and entertaining them in terms of spiritual issues as well. But we begin to see that Martha she was overburdened. Martha had that attitude that I'm the only one working. You're not giving me any help here. Verse 40 through 42. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. I need some help here. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things. And I think what he's meaning there is about many things, troubled and careful about many things. I think what he's saying is you've got a lot on your plate, and most of them aren't that important. And all those things that you have allowed to fill your plate with that aren't important, they are strangling those things that are important. For he goes on to say, but one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. We get to feel that way because sometimes it's our own fault. We try to do too much. We try to take on too many things, not only in the church, but in our whole lives. And we can have that feeling that we're the only ones working. Brethren and friends, we need help. We all need help. And we need to help each other so that we don't feel overwhelmed and that we're the only ones. Last verse on this passage, and we'll move on. Or on this point, we'll move on. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses. He was set to judge over Israel. And in verse 13 of Exodus 18, it says, And it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. All day long, Moses was there, and he was judging, he was taking care of people's issues on a daily basis. All day long, that's all he got done. And Jethro, his father-in-law, saw what was happening. In verse 17, I want to read 17 through clear down to 23. And Moses, his father-in-law, said unto him, the thing that thou doest is not good. What I said earlier, it's not sustainable. You're going to wear out. In verse 18, thou wilt surely wear away, both thou and the people that is with thee, for this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. Hearken now unto my voice, I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people Godward, and thou mayest bring the causes unto God, and they shall teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work that they must do. What he's saying is delegate and get some help. Moreover, in verse 21, thou shalt provide of all other people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, having or hating covetousness, and place such over them, to be rulers of thousands, and rulers of hundreds, and rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all seasons, and it shall be that every great matter that they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter that they shall judge, so shall it be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. Get some help. That's what he's saying. Get some help. If you're ever in a situation that you feel overwhelmed, Martha says, nobody's helping me. Elijah says, I'm the only one here. That's not sustainable. Take the advice of Jethro. Get some help. And we as Christians need to look around and see when somebody does need help. Next thing we're going to look at, that survey, they said, well, why'd you quit? Well, there was no growth opportunity. I got so far, and I could tell I wasn't going to get any more responsibility. Doing the same old thing over and over again, day in, day out. Boredom sets in. What do we call that? I was in a dead-end job. I was in a dead-end job. I got so high, I got so much responsibility, I got so much value, and that was it. I couldn't get any farther, I couldn't go any higher. I didn't have any growth opportunities. It's a danger in the church as well. No growth opportunities, no desire to grow. People quit the church because they don't grow. They stay the same. People quit their jobs because they're not growing. People quit the church because they're not growing. In Hebrews chapter 5. Condemnation for those that aren't growing. Starting in verse 12. For when the time that ye ought to be teachers, ye have need that one teach you again, which be the first principles of the oracles of God, and are become such as having need of milk and not of strong meat. For every one that uses milk is unskillful in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But strong meat belongeth to them which are of full age, even those who by reason of use, having their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. He says there's those among you that should be growing, and you're not. You're stagnant. You haven't grown. And in verse 1 of the next chapter, therefore, leaving the principles of the doctrine of Christ, let us go on to perfection, not laying again the foundation of repentance from dead works and of faith towards God. He goes on to say that how important that is. And he said, we're going to do that if we, to come back. This is what we do in verse 3. If God permits, we're going to reestablish that. We're going to revisit it. But you've got to move on. You've got to grow. People quit the church because they're not growing. They're stagnant. They've gotten as far as they want or as far as they think they can. I'm not talking about in position. I'm just talking about spiritual growth. They've gotten as far as they can. Christ said, if you're not with me, you're against me. If you're not moving forward, you're falling back. If a plant's not growing, it's dying. And if a Christian's not growing, he's dying. She's dying. We quit because we don't grow. In 2 Peter chapter 1, Christians quit the church because they haven't grown. 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. And besides this, it's interesting to me that Peter starts this, the very beginning of the letter, he addresses growth. Goes through 4 verses of introduction, and then he just hits it because people have to grow. In verse 5, and besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge temperance, and to temperance patience, and to patience godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness. We talked about that. And to brotherly kindness charity, love. For if these things be in you and abound, they may make that ye shall neither be barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. You're not going to quit. And in verse 10, wherefore the rather, brethren, give diligence to make your calling and election sure, for if ye do these things, namely grow, if you grow, you will never fail. You will never quit if you keep growing in the church. If you stop growing in the church, you're going to quit. Why do people quit their jobs? Because they stop growing. Why do people quit the church? Because they stop growing. That NPR survey was pretty good. That's why people quit. Last thing. They say, well, the benefit really wasn't worth the effort. They weren't getting enough out of what they were putting in. Maybe the wages weren't up to par. Maybe the benefit package wasn't there. Maybe they weren't getting enough vacation. But in the end, they said, it's just not worth it. What I'm receiving from this job is certainly not worth what I'm putting into this job. And Christians quit because of that perceived discrepancy between what they get out of being a Christian and what they put into being a Christian. It's just not worth it. You ever had a job like that you said, that's just not worth, I'm getting paid pennies, and I've got responsibility, I've got duties, I've got long hours, I'm going to find something else. People do the same thing in church. They quit the church. Being a Christian is hard. It can be hard. There are temptations of Satan. There are pleasures in this world that can entice. There are struggles. There are challenges. There are life's pains that we have to deal with. Loss of loved ones. Loss of loved ones from a spiritual nature. Hardships every day. It can be tough. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul reveals that it can be tough being a Christian. And sometimes you might say, oh, it's so hard, it's not worth it. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. Sometimes people come to the conclusion it's just not worth it. I think Jeremiah, as I recall, I don't remember what chapter or verse. I think it might be chapter 10, and don't quote me on this, but 8, 9, 10, something like that. But Jeremiah even said, he said, your word was, talking about God, he said, your word was a strife and it was a difficulty for me daily. It was hard. And he said, therefore I decided I'm not going to speak the word anymore. Sometimes people get that way. Being a Christian can be so hard that they're just gonna give up. Not going to do it anymore. And it can be hard. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24 through 28, Paul, recounting the things that he had gone through for the sake of Christ, he says of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes, save one. Thrice was I beaten with rods, once was I stoned, thrice I suffered shipwreck. At night and a day I have been in the deep, in journeyings often, in perils and waters, in perils and robbers, in perils by mine own countrymen, in perils by the heathen, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils among false brethren, and weariness and painfulness, in watchings often, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness, and besides all this physical ailments and physical distress, because besides all those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, the care of all the churches. And it was tough for Paul. Maybe Paul could have said it's just not worth it, but he knew better. Jeremiah could have said it's just not worth it, but he knew better. After he said, the word was I think it was derision. It was difficult for me daily, and I said, I'm not going to speak the word of the Lord anymore. And he said, but the word was like a fire in my bones, and I couldn't withstand it, because he knew that the difficulty could never outweigh the benefit. Last verse we'll look at is in Romans chapter 8. We need to always keep in mind, no matter what Satan brings against us, that the difficulties are never outweighed by the benefits of being a Christian. In Romans chapter 8, we'll just read verse 16 through 18. The Spirit itself beareth witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. Think about that. The Spirit tells you that as a Christian, you are a child of God. And he goes on to say how important that is, the benefit and the magnitude of that. And if children, then heirs of God, will inherit what God has, eternity, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. This is a risk-reward analysis here. An analysis of the effort versus the benefit. And in verse 18 he says, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. I reckon that too. That whatever Satan has against us, whatever hardships that befall us, that they are not worthy to be compared to the glory that we're going to have in and through Christ. We're going to end the lesson there. I